Good evening, gentle listener. Tonight we step away from the hurried world of deadlines and notifications, away from the bright screens and busy streets, and climb somewhere quieter, somewhere older. We're traveling back to a time when the air itself held stories, when mountains were not just stone but the very bones of sleeping titans, and when a goddess was born who would one day rule the heavens with a dignity that could silence thunder itself. Feel free to settle in wherever you are, perhaps with a warm cup of tea, maybe wrapped in your softest blanket. And if you'd like, let me know in your thoughts where you're listening from tonight, what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something deeply comforting about knowing that others are drifting toward the same ancient stories, toward the same gentle mythology that has lulled minds to rest for thousands of years. So close your eyes if you wish, let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of these words, and let's begin with what the Greeks believed happened long, long ago, when the world was younger and the gods were just learning how to be divine. Tonight, we tell the story of Hera, queen of the heavens, goddess of marriage and protector of women, but also a figure far more complex than the golden statues suggest. She was fierce and jealous, yes, but also deeply loyal, profoundly dignified, and perhaps the most human of all the immortals in her capacity for both love and wounded pride. Her story begins not in the marble halls of Olympus, not in the golden light of eternal afternoon, but in darkness, in the belly of a titan who feared his own children more than he feared the judgment of time itself. Let us drift back, then, to the age of the Titans, when Kronos ruled the cosmos with an iron grip and a troubled heart. Kronos, son of the earth and sky, had overthrown his own father, Uranus, in an act of violence so decisive that it split the heavens from the earth forever. But victory, even divine victory, carries its own shadows, and Kronos had heard a prophecy that chilled his immortal blood. One of his children would rise to overthrow him, just as he had overthrown his father before him. Fear, it seems, makes monsters of even the mightiest, and Kronos chose the most terrible solution he could imagine. Each time his wife, Rhea, bore him a child, each time new life stirred in the cosmic cradle, Kronos would take the infant in his massive hands and swallow it whole. One by one, his children vanished into the darkness of his being. First came Hestia, gentle goddess of the hearth, her light extinguished before it could warm a single home. Then Demeter, who would have blessed the earth with grain and fruit, swallowed before she could touch a single seed. Hades followed, the future lord of the underworld, consumed before he could claim his shadowy realm. But it was Hera's fate that perhaps strikes us most deeply tonight, for she was born with a natural majesty, a presence that even as an infant seemed to command respect. The myths tell us that from the moment of her birth, there was something queenly about her, something that suggested she was meant for a throne, for a crown that would catch the light of distant stars. And yet, like her siblings before her, she too disappeared into the terrible darkness of her father's fear. Picture it now, if you will, Rhea, the Earth Mother, holding her newborn daughter for perhaps only moments, seeing in those infant eyes the flash of future wisdom, the hint of the regal bearing that would one day make mortals and immortals alike step back in reverence. And then the shadow falls, the enormous hands reach down, and another light is extinguished, another voice silenced before it can speak its first divine word. But here's what Kronos, in all his paranoid wisdom, failed to understand. You cannot swallow time itself, you cannot digest destiny, and you certainly cannot keep a queen imprisoned forever, even in the depths of your own being. For somewhere in that primordial darkness, Hera waited, growing not just in size but in power, in dignity, in the quiet strength that would one day shake the foundations of Olympus itself. The years passed, if years have meaning for beings trapped outside of time, and with each passing season, Rhea's grief grew deeper and her determination stronger. When she felt the stirring of new life within her once more, when she knew that another child was coming, she made a decision that would change the course of divine history forever. This child, she vowed, would not meet the same fate as his siblings. This child would live, would grow, would fulfill the prophecy that Kronos so desperately feared. And so, when Zeus was born, Rhea played the cleverest trick in all of mythology. She wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes, made it cry with the voice of winds through mountain caves, and presented it to her husband as if it were the child itself. Kronos, perhaps blinded by his own fear, perhaps simply too accustomed to his terrible ritual, swallowed the stone without question. Meanwhile, the real Zeus was spirited away to a cave on the island of Crete, where he was raised by nymphs and protected by warriors who clashed their shields to mask his cries. There he grew, hidden from his father's sight, nursing on the milk of the goat Amalthea, learning strength from the wild winds and wisdom from the ancient stones. And when Zeus came of age, tall and golden and crackling with the power of storms yet to come, he returned to face his father with a plan as clever as his mother's deception. Disguised as a young cupbearer, he approached Kronos with a cup of wine, but this was no ordinary vintage. Mixed within was a potion so powerful, so persuasive, that it compelled the Titan to give up everything he had consumed, everything he had stolen, everything he had hidden in the darkness of his fear. One by one, Zeus's siblings emerged, not as infants now, but as fully grown gods and goddesses, blinking in the sudden light of freedom, their divine power undiminished by their long imprisonment. And among them, stepping forth with a bearing so regal that even Zeus himself paused in recognition, came Hera. She was, the poets tell us, magnificent from the first moment of her liberation. Tall and proud, with eyes like golden honey and hair that seemed to hold the warmth of summer afternoons, she moved with the measured grace of one born to rule. There was no awkwardness in her divine limbs, no uncertainty in her gaze. She had spent her imprisonment not in despair but in preparation, and now she stood before her brother Zeus as his equal in majesty, if not in the particular powers that would soon define their reigns. But here's what strikes me as most remarkable about this moment, gentle listener. Hera did not emerge from her long captivity broken or bitter. Yes, she would later become famous for her jealousy, for her fierce protection of the institution of marriage, for her unwillingness to forgive those who crossed her. But in this first moment of freedom, she was simply a goddess discovering her own power, a queen finding her throne. The war that followed, the great titanomachy that would rage for 10 long years and reshape the very foundations of reality, that is a story for another night. What matters now, as we drift toward our own peaceful rest, is this image. Hera stepping into the light, magnificent and unbroken, ready to claim her place among the greatest powers in the universe. And somewhere in the distance, whether she knew it or not, Olympus was waiting. A mountain wreathed in clouds, a palace of marble and gold, a throne that would know the weight of a queen's wisdom for countless ages to come. All of this lay ahead, but for now, there was simply the joy of breath, the pleasure of light, the quiet satisfaction of being, at last, exactly who she was meant to be. Sleep now, traveler. Let the image of that first moment of freedom settle into your dreams. And know that somewhere in the space between waking and sleeping, between the world we know and the world we imagine, a goddess stands in golden light, ready to begin the greatest story ever told. Tomorrow, or perhaps in another dream, we'll follow her further. We'll see how she came to Olympus, how she caught the eye of Zeus himself, and how a queen learned to rule not just with power, but with the kind of dignity that makes even thunder wait for permission to speak. Let the quiet settle around you now, like gentle snow falling on ancient hillsides, and we'll continue our journey with Hera, no longer the imprisoned infant, but now a goddess coming into her full power. Tonight, we follow her steps as she discovers what it means to love a storm, to marry thunder itself, and to learn that even queens must sometimes choose between their hearts and their crowns. The great war against the Titans had ended. The cosmos had been divided among the victorious brothers, and now Olympus rose from the mists like a dream made manifest. Picture it, if you will, marble columns catching the first light of dawn, halls that echoed with divine laughter, gardens where the very air shimmered with possibility. This was to be the new home of the gods, a place where immortals could gather, could feast, could love and quarrel and make the kind of magnificent mistakes that would echo through eternity. And among all these new divinities, none commanded more attention, more quiet reverence than Hera. She had claimed dominion over marriage, over the sacred bonds that tied mortals together, but also over the deeper mysteries of union itself. She understood, perhaps better than any other god, that true power came not from conquest but from alliance, not from ruling alone but from choosing the right partner to rule beside. It was perhaps inevitable, then, that Zeus himself would notice her. He who had overthrown the old order, who commanded the lightning and made the very heavens tremble with his voice, found himself drawn to the one goddess who seemed utterly unimpressed by his displays of power. When Zeus hurled thunderbolts, the other gods ducked for cover. When he raised his voice, mountains trembled. But Hera, magnificent Hera, would simply arch one perfectly sculpted eyebrow and continue whatever conversation she'd been having, as if to say that thunder was all very well, but it hardly compared to the quiet strength of true dignity. This naturally fascinated him completely. The myths tell us that Zeus pursued her with all the subtlety of an earthquake, all the delicacy of a summer storm. He appeared to her in his most glorious form, wreathed in golden light, his voice like distant thunder rolling across clear skies. He spoke of how beautiful she was, how her presence made even Olympus itself seem brighter, how he could offer her a throne beside his own, a crown to match his golden scepter. And Hera, wise in the ways of power and wiser still in the ways of the heart, listened to all this with the patience of someone who had learned to wait, who had spent her imprisonment not in bitterness but in observation. She had watched, from whatever strange vantage point the swallowed gods maintained, as the world turned and mortals loved and lost and tried again. She understood that pretty words were easy, that promises made in passion were often forgotten when the passion faded. She told him no. Not harshly, not with cruelty, but with the kind of quiet finality that suggested the matter was closed, the conversation was finished, and perhaps Zeus might consider finding someone else to impress with his atmospheric theatrics. This response delighted Zeus even more, because it confirmed what he had suspected from the first moment he saw her step into the light. Here was a goddess who could not be conquered, could not be overwhelmed, could not be reduced to a mere ornament for his court. Here was someone worthy of him, someone whose very refusal to be impressed was itself impressive. And so he tried again, this time with gifts. Golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides, each one containing the light of a star. Jewelry crafted by Hephaestus himself, so beautiful that it made the northern lights seem like cheap costume pieces. Robes woven from the silk of clouds, dyed with the colors of sunset. Each gift was returned, politely but firmly, with a note suggesting that Zeus might want to try understanding her rather than trying to purchase her. The other gods watched this courtship with fascination and not a little amusement. Apollo composed songs about it, Artemis shook her head at the foolishness of it all, and Aphrodite, goddess of love herself, found herself oddly invested in seeing how this particular romance would unfold. Because it was becoming clear to everyone, perhaps even to Zeus himself, that this was no ordinary pursuit. This was the Storm King learning humility, the ruler of the heavens discovering that there were still things in the universe that could not be commanded. And what of Hera during all this divine attention? She continued her work, learning the intricate laws that governed marriage among mortals, understanding the sacred nature of vows spoken before witnesses, the profound power of two lives choosing to become one. She established her first temples, received her first prayers from mortal women who understood instinctively that here was a goddess who would protect them, who would honor their choices and defend their marriages against those who would dissolve them on a whim. But she was not unaffected by Zeus's attention. How could she be? He was magnificent in his way, terrible and beautiful like a storm seen from a safe distance. When he spoke of ruling together, of sharing the burden and the glory of divine kingship, she could see the truth of it, the rightness of it. They were, she began to realize, perfectly matched. His power and her wisdom, his dramatic gestures and her quiet strength, his tendency to act and her ability to think 3 moves ahead. The change came, as these things often do, not in a moment of grand drama, but in a moment of gentleness. Zeus appeared to her one morning not as the king of the gods, but as a simple cuckoo bird, bedraggled and trembling in the cold. He threw himself at her feet, or rather at the hem of her robe, with such apparent helplessness that Hera's natural compassion overcame her caution. She lifted the small bird, warming it against her breast, speaking to it in the soft voice she reserved for creatures in need of care. And in that moment, when her guard was down, when she was simply being kind rather than queenly, Zeus revealed himself. Not with thunder and lightning this time, but with a proposal that was both passionate and respectful, urgent and patient. He asked her to marry him not because she was beautiful, though she was, not because it would strengthen his rule, though it would, but because he had come to understand that he was only half a king without her. He needed her wisdom to balance his power, her steadiness to anchor his storms, her deep understanding of commitment to teach him what it truly meant to promise forever. And Hera, looking into his eyes and seeing there not the arrogant storm king but the god who had been clever enough to save his siblings, brave enough to overthrow a titan, and humble enough to appear before her as a creature in need of warmth, gave him the answer he had been hoping for. She said yes. Their wedding was the most magnificent celebration in the history of the cosmos. Every god attended, bringing gifts that would become the stuff of legend. The fates themselves wove the bridal crown, each thread spun from starlight and possibility. The earth bloomed with flowers that had never existed before, and the very air sang with harmonies that mortals would spend centuries trying to recreate. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about their wedding was not the grandeur of it, not the divine guest list or the miraculous gifts, but the vows they spoke to each other. These were not the simple promises of mortal couples, but something deeper, more complex, more aware of the weight that divine promises carry. Zeus vowed to share his throne with her, to never make a decision that affected the cosmos without her counsel, to honor her not just as his wife but as his equal in the governance of heaven and earth. And Hera, in return, vowed to stand beside him through whatever storms might come, to be his anchor when his power threatened to overwhelm him, to teach him the difference between ruling and leading, between commanding and inspiring. They were beautiful vows, spoken with sincerity and witnessed by the universe itself. And if we are honest, gentle listener, we must admit that they were also doomed to be tested in ways that neither Zeus nor Hera could possibly have imagined on that golden afternoon when they first joined hands and called themselves husband and wife. But that testing, that long education in the complexities of divine marriage, that is a story for tomorrow's dreams. Tonight, let us rest with the image of their wedding feast, of two magnificent beings choosing each other not out of convenience or strategy but out of recognition, out of the deep understanding that some partnerships are written in the stars themselves. Sleep now and dream of golden celebrations, of vows spoken under open skies, of the moment when the Queen of Heaven found her king and the storm found its anchor. Rest well, traveler, for tomorrow we'll discover what happens when even the most perfect promises meet the imperfect reality of a mortal life. The fire burns low tonight, gentle listener, and in the dancing shadows we find the space for harder truths, for the stories that remind us that even gods must learn to be mortal in their hearts. Tonight we follow Hera as she discovers what it means to love someone whose very nature seems designed to test the boundaries of devotion, someone whose power is matched only by his capacity for choices that will echo through eternity. The honeymoon period of their divine marriage, if we may call it that, was everything a romance between cosmic forces should be. Zeus and Hera ruled Olympus together with a harmony that made the other gods pause in their own quarrels to admire the perfect balance they had achieved. When Zeus spoke in council, Hera listened with the attention of someone who understood that wisdom often comes disguised as impulse. When Hera offered counsel, Zeus learned to hear not criticism but the voice of someone who saw possibilities he had missed. Their first years together were marked by grand projects, by the establishment of divine law and the creation of the complex relationship between gods and mortals that would define Greek civilization for millennia to come. They were partners in the truest sense, each bringing their own gifts to the enormous task of governing a universe that seemed determined to surprise them at every turn. But Zeus, for all his wisdom and all his genuine love for his queen, carried within himself a fundamental restlessness, a divine curiosity that could not be contained even by the most perfect of marriages. He was the god of the sky, after all, and the sky touches everything, knows no boundaries, recognizes no limits save those it chooses to accept. And slowly, gradually, with the terrible inevitability of storm clouds gathering on a clear day, that restlessness began to turn toward the world below. It started innocently enough, as these things always do. Zeus would venture down from Olympus to walk among mortals, ostensibly to observe their progress, to ensure that divine justice was being upheld, to gather the kind of first-hand knowledge that only comes from seeing the world through mortal eyes. He would return with stories of remarkable humans, of heroes and poets and kings whose deeds had caught his attention, whose lives seemed to glow with the kind of potential that attracted divine interest. Hera listened to these stories with pleasure at first, glad to see her husband so engaged with his responsibilities, so interested in the mortals they had both pledged to guide and protect. She understood that a king, even a divine one, must know his subjects, must walk among them sometimes to understand the weight of the decisions made in distant palaces. She was, after all, the goddess of marriage, and she knew that even the strongest unions required periods of individual growth, moments when each partner explored their own nature without the constant presence of the other. But gradually, subtly, she began to notice changes in these reports. Zeus would return from his journeys with a distracted air, his attention turning inward in ways that suggested he was carrying thoughts, perhaps memories, that he was not yet ready to share. His stories of mortal deeds became less detailed, more hurried, as if he were eager to move past them to other matters. And sometimes, just sometimes, Hera would catch him gazing out from Olympus toward the mortal world with an expression she had never seen before, a look of longing that seemed to bypass her entirely and fix itself on something invisible in the distance. The first time she discovered the truth, it came not as a dramatic revelation but as a small, almost insignificant detail that nonetheless changed everything. Zeus had returned from one of his journeys carrying the faint scent of unfamiliar flowers, flowers that did not grow on Olympus, flowers that she later learned bloomed only in a particular valley where a mortal princess named Io tended her father's sacred groves. When Hera asked about the flowers, Zeus's answer came just a moment too quickly, with just a touch too much casualness. He had passed through the valley, he said, and the mortals there had honored him with garlands. Nothing more, nothing worth dwelling upon. But Hera, who had learned to read the subtle signs of divine emotion over their years together, heard in that quick response the echo of something unspoken, something carefully omitted. She said nothing in that moment, chose instead to watch and wait and hope that her growing suspicions were merely the product of an imagination made paranoid by her own deep love. But love, she was learning, could be its own kind of torment, its own source of clarity that revealed truths she would have preferred to remain hidden. The confirmation came, as it always does, in a way that made denial impossible. Returning unexpectedly from a visit to her temple in Argos, Hera arrived at Olympus to find Zeus in urgent, whispered conversation with Hermes, their voices carrying the kind of careful intensity that suggested conspiracy. They separated when they saw her, too quickly and too obviously, like children caught in some elaborate game they were not supposed to be playing. And that night, when Zeus thought she was sleeping, Hera heard him leave their palace, heard the whisper of divine movement that meant he was traveling not to some urgent divine business but down to the mortal world, down to valleys where princesses tended sacred groves and left garlands for visiting gods. The pain of that moment, gentle listener, was not simply the pain of betrayal, though that was certainly part of it. It was also the deeper anguish of recognition, the terrible understanding that the man she had married, the God she had trusted with her heart and her crown, was perhaps not capable of the kind of fidelity she had believed was the foundation of their union. She followed him that night, invisible in her divine power, her heart hoping desperately that she would find some innocent explanation, some misunderstanding that would restore the peace of her world. Instead, she found Zeus in his most beautiful human form, walking hand in hand with Io through moonlit groves, speaking to her in the tender voice that Hera had thought was reserved for herself alone. And in that moment, watching her husband offer to another woman the gentle attention that had first captured her own heart, Hera felt something fundamental shift within her. The trusting wife began to transform into something harder, more careful, more aware of the gap between divine promises and divine actions. She did not confront them that night. Instead, she returned to Olympus, to her empty bed, to the hollow chambers where their perfect partnership had so recently flourished. She lay awake until dawn, watching the light grow outside their windows, and made the kind of decisions that would define the rest of her immortal existence. If Zeus would not honor their marriage through choice, she would teach him to honor it through consequence. If he could not find in her love sufficient reason for fidelity, perhaps he could find in her power sufficient reason for caution. She was, after all, not simply his wife but his queen, not merely his partner but his equal in divine authority. The next morning, she appeared at the breakfast table with her usual grace, spoke to Zeus with her customary warmth, asked about his plans for the day with apparent genuine interest. She gave no sign that anything had changed, no indication that she knew what she knew. But something had changed, something had shifted in the careful balance of their divine marriage. The trusting partnership that had seemed so perfect, so inevitable, had revealed itself to be more fragile than either of them had imagined. And Hera, queen of heaven, protector of marriage itself, began to understand that she would need to become something new, something harder, something prepared for a kind of love that would require not surrender but vigilance. Sleep now, gentle traveler, and let these shadows settle into dreams that will prepare you for tomorrow's tales. For we have only begun to explore the long education of a goddess who must learn to love without illusion, to rule without bitterness, to forgive without forgetting. Rest well, and know that even in the darkest hours of divine marriage, there burns still the possibility of wisdom, of growth, of the kind of love that survives not because it is easy but because it is true. The stars will overhead tonight, ancient and patient, and in their slow dance we find the rhythm for darker tales, for the stories that teach us how even divine love can become something sharp, something calculated, something that cuts as precisely as it once healed. Tonight we follow Hera as she learns the most difficult lesson of all: how to love someone who will never stop giving you reasons to stop. The affair with Io was not the end but the beginning, the first note in a symphony of betrayals that would play across the centuries like thunder rolling from one horizon to the next. Zeus, it seemed, had discovered something in those moonlit groves that he could not find on Olympus, some intoxicating combination of novelty and conquest that made even his perfect marriage feel constrained by comparison. And Hera, watching from her throne with eyes that had learned to see everything while revealing nothing, began to understand that she had two choices before her. She could pretend not to notice, could smile and wave and play the role of the gracious queen who was above such petty concerns as her husband's wandering affections. Or she could acknowledge what was happening and respond to it, not as a wounded wife but as a ruler whose authority was being publicly challenged with every divine liaison. She chose the second path, and in making that choice, she began her transformation from beloved bride into something more complex, more feared, more powerful. She became the goddess who would teach the cosmos that actions have consequences, that even gods must face the results of their choices, that divine power does not grant immunity from divine justice. Her response to Io became the template for all that would follow, a masterpiece of precise vengeance that served multiple purposes at once. She could not touch Zeus directly, not without fracturing the very foundations of their shared rule, but she could certainly address the mortal women who welcomed his attention, who seemed to believe that accepting the embraces of the king of the gods came without any price at all. The transformation of Io into a white heifer was not, as later poets would claim, an act of blind jealousy. It was surgical in its precision, poetic in its justice. Io had enjoyed the protection of Zeus's power, had basked in the golden light of divine favor. Very well, she would learn what it meant to be helpless, to be voiceless, to wander the earth unable to explain her true nature to anyone who might offer aid. But Hera's true brilliance lay not in the transformation itself, but in what came after. She appointed Argus, the hundred-eyed giant, to watch over Io with unblinking vigilance. Here was divine irony at its finest. The woman who had enjoyed secret meetings with Zeus would now live under the constant gaze of a creature who literally never slept, who could not be charmed or distracted or bribed into looking away. When Zeus sent Hermes to lull Argus to sleep and free Io, Hera was ready for that too. She took the giant's 100 eyes and placed them on the tail of the peacock, her sacred bird, where they would shine forever as a reminder that the Queen of Heaven sees everything, forgets nothing, and memorializes even her defeats in ways that become victories. But Io was only the first, only the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself across centuries with variations that spoke to Hera's growing sophistication in the art of consequence. There was Europa, whom Zeus pursued in the form of a white bull, carrying her across the sea to distant shores where he could court her away from Hera's immediate sight. The queen's response was not direct confrontation, but something more subtle. She ensured that Europa's descendants would face trials and tribulations that would echo through generations, that the very lands named for Zeus's lover would know constant conflict and change. There was Leda, whom Zeus approached as a swan, their union producing children whose beauty would launch 1,000 ships and burn the proud towers of Troy. Hera's influence on that tale was indirect but unmistakable, woven into the very fabric of destiny so that Helen's beauty became as much a curse as a blessing, so that the love inspired by Zeus's liaison would lead to the greatest war in mythological history. And then there was Alcmene, and from their union came Heracles, and with Heracles came perhaps the most complex and long-lasting of all Hera's vengeances. For here was not simply another mortal woman to be punished, but a hero whose very existence was an affront to her dignity, whose strength and courage seemed to mock the idea that Zeus's infidelities should carry any negative consequences at all. Hera's persecution of Heracles began before his birth, when she delayed his delivery so that his cousin Eurystheus would be born first and thus claim the throne that had been promised to Zeus's son. She sent serpents to strangle him in his cradle. She drove him to madness so that he killed his own wife and children. She ensured that his famous 12 labors would be not just tests of strength but torments designed to break his spirit as much as his body. And yet, and here we find the deepest mystery of Hera's character, she was not simply cruel. Each punishment she devised, each consequence she imposed, served a larger purpose. Through Heracles, she was teaching Zeus what it meant to have a son, to watch someone you love face trials that you could prevent but choose not to. Through her persecution of his mortal lovers, she was demonstrating the real cost of his casual infidelities, the ripple effects that spread out from each divine romance to touch countless innocent lives. She was, in her way, trying to educate her husband, to show him that his actions existed not in isolation but as part of a larger web of consequence and responsibility. She was the goddess of marriage, after all, and marriage at its deepest level is about recognizing that your choices affect not just yourself but the person who has chosen to link their destiny with yours. But Zeus, storm king that he was, seemed incapable of learning the lessons she was trying to teach. Each consequence led not to repentance but to greater care and concealment, Each punishment for his lovers led not to fidelity but to more elaborate disguises and more distant meeting places. He began to transform himself not just for the pleasure of courtship but out of necessity, becoming a bull, a swan, a shower of golden rain, anything that might allow him to pursue his desires without immediate detection by his increasingly vigilant queen. And Hera, watching this escalation, began to understand something that perhaps she had been reluctant to acknowledge from the beginning. Zeus was not going to change. His nature, his divine essence, was fundamentally incompatible with the kind of exclusive devotion that she had believed was the foundation of their marriage. He was the sky, and the sky touches everything, claims everything, refuses to be contained by any boundary save those that shift with the weather and the seasons. This realization did not break her, did not send her fleeing to some distant temple to weep over her shattered illusions. Instead, it transformed her understanding of what their marriage could be, what their partnership meant in the context of cosmic rule. If Zeus would not be faithful in the conventional sense, perhaps faithfulness needed to be redefined. If he would not honor their marriage through exclusivity, perhaps he could honor it through respect, through acknowledgement of her authority, through ensuring that his affairs never diminished her status as queen. And slowly, gradually, with the patience of someone who has eternity to work with, Hera began to reshape the terms of their divine union. She remained his wife, his partner in rule, his equal in the governance of Olympus. But she also became something else, the cosmic principle of consequence, the divine reminder that all actions, even divine ones, exist within a framework of justice and accountability. Sleep now, gentle listener, and let these complexities settle into dreams that prepare you for deeper truths. For we have reached the heart of Hera's story, the place where wounded love becomes something harder and perhaps more valuable. The love that sees clearly, that demands growth, that refuses to enable the very weaknesses it longs to heal. Rest well, for tomorrow we explore how a goddess learned to rule not just with power but with the kind of wisdom that comes only from accepting the full truth of what love sometimes requires. The moon hangs full tonight, gentle listener, casting silver light on ancient truths, and in that luminous clarity we find the space to speak of transformation, of how a goddess learned to rule not despite her pain but because of it, how wounded love became the foundation for a wisdom that would outlast empires and echo through every marriage vow spoken under starlit skies. Years had passed since Hera first discovered Zeus's wandering heart, centuries during which she had refined her understanding of power, of justice, of what it truly meant to be queen of the heavens. No longer was she the trusting bride who had believed that love alone could anchor a storm. She had become something more complex, more formidable. A goddess who understood that true authority comes not from being adored but from being indispensable. And indispensable she had become, not just to Zeus but to the very fabric of divine civilization. While her husband chased his pleasures across the mortal world, Hera remained on Olympus, attending to the countless details that kept the cosmos running smoothly. She mediated disputes between the other gods, she established the protocols that govern divine behavior, she created the intricate web of relationships and obligations that transformed a collection of powerful immortals into something resembling a functional pantheon. It was Hera who insisted that divine justice must be consistent, that the same laws which govern mortals must also apply, in their way, to the gods themselves. When Ares returned from battle covered in glory and gore, it was Hera who reminded him that victory without honor was merely successful violence. When Aphrodite's schemes threatened to destabilize entire kingdoms for the sake of an amusing romantic triangle, It was Hera who quietly intervened to limit the damage. She became, without ever claiming the title formally, the true administrator of Olympus, the one who transformed Zeus's grand visions into practical realities. He might decree that mortals should have fire, but it was Hera who worked out the complex negotiations with Prometheus, who managed the political fallout when the gift proved more dangerous than expected. He might decide that Troy should fall, but it was Hera who orchestrated the delicate dance of divine alliances that made such an outcome possible without fracturing the unity of Olympus itself. In this work, she found a satisfaction that her marriage, for all its passion and pain, had never provided. Here was power that could not be taken from her by infidelity, authority that grew stronger rather than weaker with each challenge she successfully navigated. The other gods, who had once seen her primarily as Zeus's queen, began to recognize her as a force in her own right, someone whose favor was worth seeking and whose displeasure was something to be carefully avoided. But perhaps her greatest achievement during these middle years was the transformation of her role as goddess of marriage itself. Where once she had presided over the simple joining of two lives, she now became the patron of something more complex. The art of building a life together despite fundamental incompatibilities, the science of love that survives disillusionment, the courage required to choose partnership even when partnership proves more difficult than anyone had imagined. Her temples began to attract a different kind of worshiper during this period. Yes, young brides still came to seek her blessing on their wedding days, but they were joined by women whose marriages had survived their first crises, couples who had learned that love was not a feeling but a decision made fresh each day, husbands and wives who understood that the most profound unions are forged not in passion but in the quiet choice to keep choosing each other even when easier alternatives present themselves. Hera's priestesses developed rituals that reflected this deeper understanding. New ceremonies honored not just the beginning of marriages but their endurance, their evolution, their capacity to weather storms that would have broken simpler bonds. These rites acknowledged that some relationships require renegotiation, that healthy partnerships sometimes mean redefining the terms of connection when the original terms prove inadequate to the reality of growth and change. And slowly, gradually, something remarkable began to happen in Hera's own marriage. Zeus, who had perhaps expected his wife to either accept his infidelities with resigned grace or rage herself into irrelevance, found himself confronted with something he had not anticipated. A partner who had grown beyond his ability to wound her, who had found sources of power and satisfaction that existed independently of his approval or attention. This did not make him faithful, but it did make him more careful. He began to recognize that Hera's anger was not the helpless fury of an abandoned woman, but the calculated response of an equal who would not tolerate public humiliation. When he pursued Semele, he took greater pains to ensure that the affair remained genuinely secret. When he fell for Danae, he transformed himself into Golden Rain not just for the romance of it, but because he understood that discovery would carry consequences more sophisticated than any he had previously faced. More importantly, he began to consult her more seriously on matters of cosmic governance. Where once he had seen her counsel as wifely advice to be considered or dismissed as his mood dictated, he now recognized it as the perspective of someone whose understanding of complex systems had been proven through years of successful administration. Their private conversations became less about personal matters and more about the business of ruling, about the careful balance required to maintain order among beings who were both immortal and impulsive. In these moments, working side by side on problems that required both his strength and her wisdom, Zeus would sometimes catch glimpses of what their marriage might have been if they had both understood from the beginning that love between equals requires different skills than love between a conqueror and the conquered. He would see the woman he had first pursued not as a prize to be won but as a mind to be matched, a spirit that could complement his own without being diminished by it. And Hera, during these same conversations, would occasionally remember why she had agreed to marry him in the first place. Beneath the wandering eye and the divine arrogance was still the god who had been clever enough to save his siblings, bold enough to overthrow tyranny, generous enough to share power with someone whose authority might sometimes challenge his own. He was still capable of surprising her with his insights, still able to make her laugh with his observations about the absurdities of divine life. These moments did not heal their marriage in any conventional sense. Zeus did not become faithful, Hera did not forgive his past betrayals, and neither of them pretended that their relationship would ever resemble the simple love stories told to comfort mortal brides. But they did find something perhaps more valuable, a partnership based on mutual respect rather than romantic illusion, a union that served purposes larger than the happiness of either participant. Together, they created a model of divine marriage that acknowledged complexity without surrendering to cynicism, that honored commitment while recognizing the need for individual growth, that demonstrated how two powerful beings could share authority without destroying each other in the process. It was not the marriage either of them had imagined on their wedding day, but it was perhaps the marriage that the cosmos needed. Stable enough to provide continuity, dynamic enough to adapt to changing circumstances, and honest enough to acknowledge that even divine love requires wisdom more than passion. Sleep now, gentle traveler, and let these complexities settle into dreams that prepare you for deeper truths still to come. For we approach the heart of Hera's tale, the place where a goddess discovers that her greatest victory lies not in changing her husband but in becoming fully herself, not in winning his fidelity but in creating something beautiful from the reality of their imperfect but enduring bond. Rest well, knowing that tomorrow brings the completion of a story that began in swallowed darkness and leads to a wisdom bright enough to light the way for any soul brave enough to love without illusion. The hour grows quiet now, gentle listener, that peaceful time when the day releases its hold and the night opens its arms to receive our deepest thoughts. Tonight we reach the turning point in Hera's tale, the moment when a goddess who had spent centuries fighting against the nature of love itself finally discovered what it means to accept not just what is, but what was always meant to be. The great revelation came to Hera not in a flash of divine insight but slowly, like dawn creeping across the peaks of distant mountains. It began during one of the rare festivals when all the Olympians gathered together, when the marble halls rang with laughter and the ambrosia flowed like honeyed sunlight. Zeus was in his element, holding court with stories that grew more elaborate with each telling, his voice carrying that particular warmth that meant he was truly happy, truly at home among his divine family. Hera watched him from her throne, noting how the other gods leaned forward when he spoke, how even his rivals found themselves caught up in his enthusiasm. She observed the way he gestured with his hands to paint pictures in the air, the way his eyes lit up when someone offered a particularly clever response to one of his tales. And in that moment, seeing him as the others saw him, she felt something she had not experienced in centuries. Simple, uncomplicated affection for the god she had married. It struck her then that somewhere in her long campaign to change him, to make him into the husband she believed he should be, she had forgotten to appreciate the husband he actually was. Yes, he was unfaithful in the conventional sense, incapable of the exclusive devotion that mortals considered the foundation of marriage. But he was also generous, quick to forgive, endlessly curious about the world and its inhabitants. He brought gifts not just to his lovers, but to anyone who caught his attention, showering mortals with unexpected blessings simply because their courage or cleverness had amused him. More importantly, she realized that despite all his affairs, despite all the mortal women who had captured his attention over the centuries, he had never once considered replacing her as his queen. Other gods changed consorts as easily as they changed robes, but Zeus had never even hinted that any of his liaisons threatened her position as his partner in rule. His wandering eye was not a rejection of her, but simply an expression of his fundamental nature, as much a part of him as his command over thunder and storm. This understanding did not come all at once, and it certainly did not erase the pain of the past. But it began a process of re-examination that would transform not just how Hera saw her marriage, but how she understood her own divine purpose. She began to ask herself different questions. What if Zeus's infidelities were not a flaw to be corrected, but simply a fact to be managed? What if her role as goddess of marriage was not to enforce a single model of devotion, but to protect the institution itself in all its complex variations? She thought of the mortal couples who prayed at her temples, of the countless marriages she had blessed over the centuries. How many of them had faced challenges similar to her own? How many wives had learned to love husbands whose natures seemed designed to test the very bonds they had sworn to honor? How many partnerships had found ways to survive not because they were perfect, but because they were necessary, because they served purposes larger than the happiness of either individual? Slowly, carefully, Hera began to experiment with a different approach to her divine marriage. Instead of seeing Zeus's affairs as betrayals to be punished, she began to treat them as diplomatic challenges to be managed. When he fell for Callisto, instead of transforming the unfortunate nymph into a bear, Hera negotiated with Artemis to have Callisto accepted into the goddess's retinue, where her divine beauty would be channeled into service rather than scandal. When Zeus's attention turned to Aegina, Hera worked behind the scenes to ensure that their son, Aeacus, would become a king renowned for his justice and wisdom, turning what might have been another embarrassing divine liaison into a gift to mortal civilization. She discovered that she could use Zeus's romantic impulses as opportunities to extend divine influence in positive ways, to plant seeds of heroism and wisdom in mortal bloodlines that would flourish for generations. This new approach required a different kind of power than the direct confrontation she had favored in her younger years. It demanded patience, subtlety, the ability to think several moves ahead and to see patterns that others missed. But Hera found that she excelled at this kind of strategic thinking, that the skills she had developed as administrator of Olympus translated perfectly to the delicate art of managing a marriage that operated more like a diplomatic alliance than a romantic partnership. Zeus, for his part, began to notice the change in his wife's responses to his adventures. Where once she had met each new affair with storms of rage that shook the foundations of Olympus, she now responded with careful calculation, finding ways to turn his impulses to their mutual advantage. He found this new approach both surprising and, if he was honest, somewhat more unnerving than her previous fury. It was one thing to deal with an angry wife. It was quite another to realize that your wife had become sophisticated enough to use your weaknesses as tools for her own purposes. But there was something else in this new dynamic, something that reminded him of why he had pursued her so persistently in the first place. Here was the brilliant goddess he had fallen in love with, the mind that could match his own in complexity and exceed it in careful planning. Their conversations took on a new quality, a sense of two master strategists respectfully acknowledging each other's skills while pursuing complementary goals. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, Zeus began to consult Hera more regularly about his romantic plans. not seeking permission exactly, but recognizing that her insight into the broader implications of his choices had proven valuable enough to consider before acting rather than after. He found himself asking questions like, if I were to visit that mortal kingdom, how might we turn the king's gratitude to our advantage? Or, would it benefit our long-term interests if this hero's bloodline carried divine heritage? These conversations marked a fundamental shift in their relationship, a recognition that they were both powerful beings with different but complementary strengths, that their marriage worked best not when they tried to be the same person but when they functioned as a team. Zeus provided the inspiration, the grand gestures, the dramatic actions that captured mortal imagination. Hera provided the follow-through, the careful management, the long-term planning that turned momentary divine whims into lasting benefits for both gods and mortals. In this new understanding, Hera discovered something unexpected, a form of love that was deeper and more sustaining than the passionate romance she had once believed was the highest form of connection between two beings. This was love based on respect, on shared purpose, on the recognition that some partnerships transcend the personal to serve something larger than themselves. She still felt twinges of the old jealousy when Zeus's attention wandered, still experienced moments of longing for the exclusive devotion she had once believed was her due. But these feelings no longer dominated her emotional landscape. They became simply part of the complex web of emotions that any deep relationship generates over time, no more significant than the occasional irritation she felt when Zeus left his thunderbolts scattered around their chambers or his tendency to make dramatic pronouncements without considering the practical implications. What mattered more was the growing sense that their marriage had found its true form, its proper function within the larger cosmic order. They were not just husband and wife but king and queen, not just lovers but partners in the enormous task of governing a universe that seemed determined to surprise them at every turn. Sleep now, gentle traveler, and let this new understanding settle into dreams that prepare you for the final chapter of our tale. For we approach the place where Hera's story reveals its deepest wisdom, where a goddess discovers that the greatest victory is not conquering others, but becoming fully yourself, not changing the world but learning to dance with it exactly as it is. Rest well, knowing that some stories end not with triumph but with acceptance, not with getting what we wanted but with discovering that what we needed was there all along, waiting for us to become wise enough to recognize it. The stars fade gently toward dawn now, gentle listener, and in this quiet hour between night and day, we reach the end of our journey with Hera. But endings, as any goddess of wisdom learns, are simply new beginnings wearing different clothes. Tonight we discover how a story that began with swallowed children and wounded pride transforms into something luminous, something that offers hope to every soul who has ever loved imperfectly in an imperfect world. In the final chapters of Hera's tale, we find her not as the jealous wife of ancient stories, not as the vengeful queen of marble statues, but as something far more complex and beautiful. A goddess who had learned to love the world exactly as it was, including the Storm King who shared her throne and her bed and her eternal dance between passion and wisdom. The transformation was complete by the time the great age of heroes began to wane, when the last of the mighty demigods had claimed their places among the stars and the mortals had begun to build civilizations sophisticated enough to require more subtle divine guidance. Hera had become something unprecedented in the cosmic order, a deity who ruled not through fear or favor, but through the kind of deep understanding that comes only from embracing paradox, from learning to hold opposing truths in perfect balance. Her temples during this period were marvels of architectural psychology, designed not just to inspire awe but to comfort the troubled heart. The great sanctuary at Argos became a place of pilgrimage for couples whose marriages had survived their first great crisis, whose love had been tested by infidelity or loss or the simple erosion of years, and had emerged not unscathed but unbroken. Here, in chambers lit by oil lamps that never flickered, Hera's priestesses offered counsel that acknowledged the full complexity of human partnership. They taught that marriage was not a single contract but a series of daily choices, not a promise made once but a commitment renewed each morning when two people chose to wake up beside each other despite everything they had learned about each other's flaws. They spoke of love that could survive disillusionment, of partnerships that grew stronger through honest acknowledgement of each partner's limitations, of the strange alchemy that could transform wounded trust into something deeper and more valuable than naive faith. These teachings drew not just from theological study but from Hera's own lived experience, from centuries spent learning to love a husband whose very nature seemed designed to challenge every assumption about what marriage could or should be. She had discovered that the greatest love stories were not those that avoided conflict, but those that found ways to transform conflict into wisdom, to use even betrayal as raw material for building something more honest and more durable. Zeus, for his part, had grown into his role as both king and husband with a grace that would have surprised his younger self. The god who had once pursued mortal women with all the subtlety of a thunderstorm had learned the arts of discretion, of consideration, of consulting his queen not out of obligation but out of genuine respect for her insight. His affairs, when they occurred, were handled with a delicacy that honored both his own nature and Hera's dignity. More importantly, he had come to understand that his marriage to Hera was not a limitation on his divine freedom, but the foundation that made all his other relationships possible. She was the constant in his immortal life, the one being who had seen him at his worst and chosen to stay, not out of weakness but out of the kind of strength that could absorb disappointment and transform it into wisdom. Their conversations in the evening hours, when the day's divine business was finished and Olympus settled into the peaceful rhythm of immortal domesticity, had become legendary among the other gods. Here were two beings who had learned to discuss anything: cosmic policy, family politics, the amusing follies of their divine relatives, with the ease of old friends and the respect of equal partners. They could debate without arguing, disagree without diminishing each other, find humor in situations that would have sparked divine warfare in their younger years. And gradually, other divine couples began to seek their counsel. Aphrodite and Hephaestus, struggling with their own marital complexities, found in Zeus and Hera an example of how very different beings could build a life together without trying to remake each other in their own image. Poseidon and Amphitrite discovered that the royal couple could offer perspective on the challenges of ruling together, of maintaining individual identity within the framework of shared authority. Even mortal rulers began to invoke their names together, to see in the divine marriage not a warning about the dangers of divine passion but a model for how powerful people could share power without destroying each other. The phrase, "May Zeus and Hera bless your union," became more than ceremonial language. It was a prayer for the kind of love that could survive knowledge, that could find beauty in imperfection, that could transform the inevitable disappointments of intimacy into opportunities for deeper connection. But perhaps Hera's greatest achievement in these later years was the way she transformed her understanding of her own divine purpose. Where once she had seen herself primarily as Zeus's wife, with all the limitations and frustrations that role entailed, she now understood herself as the cosmic principle of enduring partnership, the divine force that enabled any two beings to build something together that neither could achieve alone. Her influence extended far beyond marriage in the conventional sense. She became the patron of all collaborative efforts, all endeavors that required two or more beings to balance their individual strengths and weaknesses in service of a shared goal. Artists who worked in partnership, rulers who shared power, friends who supported each other through decades of change, all found in Hera a goddess who understood the delicate art of maintaining individuality within the context of deep connection. And as the ages turned and the old certainties gave way to new questions, as the mortals developed philosophies complex enough to grapple with the paradoxes of existence itself, Hera's story took on new meanings. She became not just the goddess of marriage, but the divine embodiment of wisdom learned through experience, of love that had passed through fire and emerged not unburned but refined, like gold that shines more brightly for having been tested in the crucible. In the end, her tale offers something precious to anyone who has ever faced the choice between love as we wish it were and love as it actually is. She shows us that the deepest connections are forged not in the absence of conflict but in the creative response to it, that the most beautiful partnerships are those that learn to dance with each other's differences rather than trying to eliminate them. And so we leave her now, not as the story ends, but as it continues, as it always has and always will. She sits upon her throne of polished marble and starlight, her crown catching the first rays of dawn, her eyes reflecting the kind of wisdom that comes only from choosing love again and again, even when love proves more complex than any heart could have imagined. Beside her, Zeus watches the sun rise over the mortal world they both protect, and in his expression we see not the conquering storm king of old legends, but a husband who has learned that the greatest victory is not defeating your partner but discovering, each day anew, how to dance together despite the music no one else can hear. Sleep now, gentle traveler, and let this final image carry you into dreams that know no ending. For Hera's story is not finished. It continues in every marriage that chooses growth over stagnation, in every partnership that finds ways to honor both individual truth and shared commitment, in every heart that learns that love's greatest triumph is not avoiding disappointment, but transforming it into deeper understanding. Rest well and dream of golden halls where wisdom wears a crown, where love has learned to laugh at its own contradictions, where a goddess who began as a swallowed child became the queen who teaches us all what it means to reign not over others but alongside them, in the eternal democracy of the heart. The dawn breaks gently over Olympus, and in its light, all stories become one story, all love becomes the love that chooses to continue, and all queens become the queen who learned that the most beautiful throne is the one shared willingly with another sovereign soul.